Good morning and welcome to our third and final day of our Village Halls Conference. If you're joining us today for the first time or are from outside of Derbyshire, you're very welcome. My name is Helena Stubbs. I've been Village Halls Advisor in Derbyshire for about 10 years now. Once again, it's my pleasure to be chairing this morning's event. Our theme this year is Refresh, Restart and Recover as we're coming out of the pandemic. And on the first day, we heard an inspirational opening speech from Councillor Barry Lewis, the leader of Derbyshire County Council, on how communities can build back better for a more sustainable future. And he stressed that the pandemic's legacy shouldn't all be negative and how communities should capitalise and take advantage of any new opportunities post-COVID. And yesterday, Angelique Foster, the Derbyshire's Police and Crime Commissioner, highlighted the vital role that Village Halls play in helping Derbyshire to be a safer place and how they must be preserved. So as communities get back together again, now is a good time for Village Halls to look at ways of delivering a wider range of services. But however, there are often practical considerations that trustees need to be aware of and to understand whether their charitable objects will allow them to deliver these new services that they want to provide. So today's session should highlight some of these issues. But firstly, though, we must acknowledge our wonderful sponsors. We are extremely grateful for their kind and generous support, which has enabled us to open this event up free to all our delegates. So firstly, a huge thanks to ESP Projects Limited. They are our overall sponsors of the event. They're based locally in Sheffield, and they are an ethical IT service provider for businesses of all sizes and have provided RAD with excellent and friendly IT services and support over the past few years, and we're delighted that they are supporting this year's event. Here's what they have to say.
Many IT companies claim that they will offer unlimited IT support to their clients, but how often do they deliver? Here at ESP, we guarantee to deliver. We have unrivaled expertise when it comes to IT support. From PCs and laptops to servers and NAS devices, you can have the peace of mind knowing you have unlimited access to our IT engineers. If an issue cannot be resolved remotely by our help desk, we will come to you and collect or fix the system wherever you are in the UK. That's a promise. The benefits of working with ESP include guaranteed 4-hour response time, 9 out of 10 calls answered within 30 seconds, free 2 hours advisory ICT consultancy per month, add-on services such as early bird service and Saturday support. We don't take the one-size-fits-all approach to IT support contracts. We tailor them to suit your needs and budget. Need a helping hand with your IT? Get in touch with ESP.
Yeah, so thank you for that, Sky. But also we'd like to thank Zurich Insurance for kindly being the sponsors for the day. They also sponsored day one as well. There are only a handful of insurance providers that specialise in the not-for-profit sector that actually offer bespoke policies specific for village and community halls. But we do hope that you get a chance to look at our conference webpage so that you can learn a little bit more about each of the sponsors. Technical housekeeping, as you know, we're using Zoom, as most people are familiar with it. So we have automatically put people on mute and videos have been turned off. So if you haven't, can you please ensure that you're on mute so that we can't hear any of the background noise? But we'd love you to participate. So if you have any questions as we go along through the sessions this morning, what we'd like you to do to do is to use the chat function, which is at the bottom of your screen. So we welcome questions. That's part of the conference. We've allowed time for, you know, your input. But if we don't get a chance to answer everybody's questions, we will try and get back to you over the next few days, and perhaps resolve some of those issues that you're raising. But as you know, today's focus is on adapting and modernising as we're coming out of the pandemic. And we're very pleased to have 3 speakers with a vast range of knowledge and experience on charities and working with community businesses. So the first session will be Dr. Tom Archer. He can't be with us, unfortunately, and he sent us a pre-record just to talk about the work that he did writing the report on behalf of ACRE, the National Village Hall Survey, and the follow-up COVID impact survey. So that will be quite interesting to hear about the report. Followed by that, we have Chris Cowcher from the Plunkett Foundation to hear about social businesses, community businesses. And after a short break, we're very pleased to have Dr. Gareth Morgan joining us to talk about charity trading law. So there's some interesting sessions coming up. But first, we're delighted to welcome Louise Beaton for kindly joining us and to do our opening keynote address to start the day. I've personally had the great pleasure of knowing Louise through the ACRE network for around 10 years, and she never ceases to amaze me on her knowledge and experience of working with village halls. So welcome Louise, I'll pass over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Helena. Well, likewise, your knowledge and experience is fantastic. And I really wanted to start off by saying what a pleasure it is to be asked to address this conference today, and how fortunate I feel village halls in Derbyshire are to have the support service of Rural Action Derbyshire, particularly yourself, Helena. And I'm sure throughout the COVID pandemic, many halls have valued you even more. I very much hope, I was very impressed by the talk by Barry the other day, and I really do hope that the County Council and the local authorities will continue to support the service so you can continue to provide this fantastic service. So, hooray for Helena. Helena suggested that I kick off this talk by starting at the beginning before we look to the future. So what I want to do is just look briefly at the last 100 years of support for village halls. Next slide, please. So we in the ACRE network have just celebrated the centenary of the National Village Hall Service, 100 years of giving support to village halls, which started in 2021 and has continued ever since. Now, until the ending of the First World War, there were probably about 800 village halls in the country. Tom Archer's talk will tell you there are now over 10,000. And there is a reason for that growth. I was quite amused when Barry said the other day that there were quite a lot of village halls in Derbyshire. Well, there is a good reason for that. And that is rooted in the growth after the First World War, when there was the availability of Great War huts. These were the huts that had been used for the accommodation of troops, combined with the desire of communities to provide war memorials, the need for a place of entertainment, and particularly a place suitable for women and children to meet, because of course pubs were not the kind of place that a decent woman would go to at the time. But initially, there was a movement to create village clubs, which had been sort of happening for the first part of the 20th century. And there were fundraising efforts, and all those things combined together to make it realise that actually communities could not move forward in rural areas without a meeting place. Hence, the government started to provide, and so did the Carnegie UK Trust, finance, loans and grants in order to build village halls. There were, of course, older ones, the Mechanics Institute, it must be Victorian, I think, but they were few and far between until the 1920s, which became the heyday of village hall building. Rural Action Derbyshire actually came into being as one of the first members of the Acre Network in 1924, which is marvellous. You'll have your own centenary in a few years' time. And over the years, the whole Acre Network grew until there was an advisory service for village halls over the whole of the country, now funded by DEFRA and with sponsor support. But the whole network of providing advice, of providing funding to individual village halls when they need it for improvement work, does also depend on funding from the local authorities, the lottery and other funders as well. So it's a very integrated system. At our centenary event the other week, I was talking about the way the service has developed in the last few years, and there are links at the bottom here which will take you to that event. But I was talking about the way in which the information services have grown and the way in which we had a National Village Hall Forum which has tackled a number of issues such as red tape, the lack of capital funding, VAT problems and governance. You can get involved in the Acre Centenary through your village hall by putting it onto the Acre Doomsday site, on which you can post a photograph and a short description of your hall. Next slide, please. So 100 years on, how are halls doing? Well, Tom will talk about the trends. I'm going to pick out 3 small items only. Firstly, the massive growth in health and wellbeing activity, particularly exercise classes, which have become probably one of the mainstays of income for halls and really important for the health of the rural population. Secondly, there's a big problem with difficulty recruiting volunteers. Now, almost half of village halls reporting that this is a regular problem. I'll come back to that. And thirdly, there's been a stalling in the investment in renewable energy since the last survey was carried out. Halls doing their bit with energy efficiency work, but actually going the extra mile has clearly needed funding streams from outside. And since those have become more difficult, those have not, basically installing renewables has not moved forward. So we need those funding streams to get back to becoming carbon neutral. There's been the challenge of COVID. I suspect Tom will talk about the survey we've done into how halls are doing, but I really want to say thank you to all of you for rising to this very difficult situation. Halls have, on the one hand, been either financially better off or worse off as a result of it. There's been a bit of a polarisation, and it does look as though the halls serving larger populations are those that are worse off. Probably the reason being that they're more likely to have activities that have carried on during the lockdowns, consequently incurred the costs, ongoing costs of staying open. So those halls that are actually better off have been able to invest in the facilities. So we're seeing halls that are looking smarter. They've been able to attend to old toilets or what have you. And they've come back with a new lease of life, with sometimes new trustees who feel reinvigorated because they've not been struggling to run the hall in the meantime. But others have lost trustees. We know that some halls are really struggling to recruit, and this is where the advice from somebody like Helena is really important. We're also seeing changes in use. Some activities have just gone, they've closed, whereas other new activities have come forward, often new classes. What I would say is that very few halls are the same as they were before COVID. What I would suggest is that actually now, after COVID, there is an opportunity as you hold events to reach out to the community, talk to people and ask that what they would like for the future. Next slide, please. So there are opportunities ahead. Investing in young people. Many halls are not terribly good about making sure their hall offers something for young people. It needs thought, it needs attention, and it needs discussing with young people in the community. Obviously, health and wellbeing activities, this is the big growth area. It's very easy to think, well, we have a Keep Fit class, we don't need to look for more. But actually, those often attract ladies of a certain age, if I might say so, myself included. Whereas actually men, young people are not necessarily reached out to in the same way, because those classes may not be in the evening or the weekend when they're available, or before work. There are loads of activities that are becoming more popular now and doing really well in village halls. Things like opening up community cafes, coffee mornings, afternoon teas, pop-up pubs, family quizzes, games evenings or afternoons, film shows, drama, arts and crafts. These were once the mainstay of village halls, which have rather gone away. Actually, we're seeing a resurgence of them, which is just brilliant. But we do need to remember that these activities need to be accessible for everybody. And there is a growing realization that actually people with dementia can find it unwelcoming to come to village halls. But there are things that can be done very simply, very cheaply to make them welcome. And this is something that you'll probably be hearing more about soon. Obviously, Wi-Fi is now essential, and the best investment you can do at the moment probably is to provide the best quality Wi-Fi you can, bearing in mind, obviously, the difficulties in some rural areas. We've seen during the pandemic that halls have become a meeting space for home workers. They've been very adaptable as showrooms for local companies, for people running things like martial arts classes out of the hall that people have watched via Zoom and participated in at home. There's more that can be done here. And of course, there is climate change. That's the other opportunity. We heard the other day on Monday about the grants that will be available for heat pumps and electric vehicle charging points. New slide. So what I would finish by saying is that whilst it's really important to be receptive to new ideas, is you do need to remember the basics. You need to have an eye on what are the charity's objects. And of course, the objects of a village hall are very much about providing a hall that reaches out, provides services for the more vulnerable members of the community. It is about social education and well-being for the local community. So other things have to sort of fit around that. It's not impossible. It might require a bit of thinking about, but the golden rule is whatever you do, you have to act in the best interest of the charity. I think it's important to remember that anybody can be a hall trustee. Given the difficulties with recruitment, we tend to see people thinking, oh, we don't have the right people here, and that, you have to be a certain kind of person to be a hall trustee. No, the committee members of a village hall should be anybody. They should represent a cross-section of the community, and anybody can step up for the job. I've just come across a village hall in Sussex which has a chairman who is 22 years old. We need more people like that involved in village halls. We need that new blood. Obviously, Helena, Rural Action Derbyshire can help if hall governance needs updating in order to help you deliver what you need to do now, or to recruit the right people onto your committee. Don't be afraid to invest in marketing. It's very easy to think social media is a danger. It's going to get in the way, but actually it can be so helpful. And if you don't have the skills yourselves, just recruit somebody young from the community. A teenager is ideal. Just make sure they give you the passwords to your sites. Do take the opportunity to network with other halls via Rural Action Derbyshire, because there is a huge wealth of experience out there in other halls, and just talking to other people, you get so many ideas. It's so helpful to be able to do that, and I'm sure in due course you'll find there are more platforms available to do that. What you can do is take the opportunity after COVID to do a SWOT analysis of your hall. That is, look at the strengths, the weaknesses, the opportunities and the threats. Think about your strengths. Many halls have problems such as lack of parking, small main hall, that kind of thing. Actually, they are usually halls that have character, and you can play on that kind of thing to attract different kinds of activities, give it a different flavour from your neighbouring halls so that you're not competing with each other, but you are playing to your strengths. And if your hall does need improvement work, well, don't forget there are sources of funding still available. The Awards for All grant scheme from the lottery, and your parish council does have powers to raise a precept and, if necessary, a large loan in order to support what you do at your hall. My final tip would be, and I'm really keen on this, I think especially with COVID, we've seen some of the fun going out of managing our village halls. Actually, trustees, volunteers should enjoy the role, enjoy being together to help the community. And if there are jobs that you can't recruit volunteers for, then do try to pay people to do them so that everybody else isn't overburdened by them. And this is where a parish council, a small grant from the parish council to enable you to pay a little bit for some of those tasks might just help you move forward for the future. I just want to leave by saying thank you all so much for everything you do for your halls. Thank you.
Thank you, Louise. That's really inspirational, and a whistle-stop tour of all the things to cover and think about. So that's 10 minutes was hard to get it all in, but that's fantastic. I'd just like to add that I was really lucky to attend the recent centenary event for Village Halls, and it was really, really interesting. But just to point out, I believe it's available on the Acre website. I think all the talks and the guest speakers, it was recorded. So anybody interested to hear about the full story about the centenary and the history of Village Halls, it's very much well worth looking at that recording. Louise, thank you so much. I believe you're going to stay around all morning. So anybody that wants to put some questions, do put that in chat, and if time allows, I know that Louise is going to be happy to address any of those issues. So we're going to move swiftly on now to the talk by Tom Archer. It's a recording, so he's not going to be available to answer questions, but it's a really interesting overview of the recent national survey and the follow-up COVID impact report survey. So I'll pass over to Tom Archer.
Well, good morning, conference. My name is Dr. Tom Archer from Sheffield Hallam University. I'm going to talk you through some key findings from our work with Acre over the last couple of years, looking at the National Village Hall Survey in 2020, and then following up to look at the impact of COVID-19 on village halls in England earlier this year. Apologies that I can't be with you today for the Q&A at the end, but I hope the presentation provides plenty of food for thought and space for discussion and thinking around how village halls can recover from what has been an incredible external shock. So I will share my slides with you to help us along the way. I'm going to talk first of all about the Village Hall survey in 2020, and our job really was to analyse the data that come back from that survey. Surveys were completed between February and April 2020, so it's really important to state that survey and the report captures a kind of pre-COVID-19 perspective. And we'll return to that issue throughout. But it gave us a really good basis for analysing and building a picture of village halls in England in 2020. We had over 2,000 valid responses, which constitute approximately 21% of all known halls. Now, one of the things that comes out of the report is we start to see the kind of role and position of halls within their communities, and around 60% of those that responded were the only hall or meeting place in their village. So if we value these community spaces and the things that go on within them, it really asserts just what important role halls can play to local communities. And again, that's a theme that we will respond to throughout, particularly in terms of the pandemic. the questions, there are lots of questions in the survey, and we're really grateful that some of you will have completed that and took the time to do it. There were specific questions in there around Village Hall, the fabric of the buildings and the environmental impact of Village Halls. Over the last 5 years, prior to 2020, 70% of halls had undertaken improvement work, and we tried to value that to show that between 47 and 98 million was being spent into the economy, and because 85% of halls stated that expenditure was largely going to local suppliers, that's a really important contribution to local economies. Now 16% of halls were planning renovation work costing over £100,000, and we estimate the value of that work over the coming years would be between 380 and 730 million pounds. So again, really important and sizable expenditure into local economies. And when we looked at the things and asked about the elements of village halls that were inadequate or in need of repair, there were some big expenditure items in there. So large proportions needing to replace roofs and gutterings and heating systems, so you can start to understand some of the big investments that needed to be made. Just under half of respondent halls stated that they had procedures in place to minimise their environmental impact. And that was up quite significantly from 2009. In practical terms, what we could see was investment in new technologies that would reduce the environmental impact. So I think in 2009, 22 respondents had photovoltaic panels, but that was up to about 250 in 2020. So there's clearly some investment taking place there. The downside really was that respondents felt the frequency of public transport that could be used to access the hall had declined over the last 5 years, which suggests maybe more reliance on car usage to get to and from halls. So there is some kind of trade-offs clearly here taking place. We asked a number of questions about management and staffing, and 88% of the halls we spoke to are registered charities, but clearly halls are adopting this charitable incorporated organisation structure. So 13% of halls that we spoke to had adopted that. And what really comes across, and this is something that I think is perhaps underestimated in the wider policy making and funding field, is just what a central role volunteers are playing in the operation of this kind of key local infrastructure within halls. 73% of those we spoke to had a volunteer booking secretary, 40% had volunteer caretakers and handy persons, and we can really put a value on that voluntary time, and I think it's important that we do that. Added to that, again, on local economic contribution, within respondent halls, we think 10,000 individuals are earning a living, part of their living through that hall, providing services and paid for services, which is another important indirect contribution to local economies. Halls, in a significant way, have worries and have experienced difficulties in recruiting new committee members, and that when we talk about the impact of COVID-19 is a continued worry, and we'll return to that a little bit later. What we see really from the kind of business models of halls is that a large proportion are very small, with low running costs less than £10,000 a year, and half of halls are making a surplus, which actually was a slight increase from 2009. But halls serving smaller communities were more dependent on fundraising activity. Around 3/4 of halls believed that they'd remain financially viable for the next 5 years. At least that was their perspective in 2020, and that was marginally up from 2009 as well. But it was small halls with fewer financial resources that were less likely to see themselves as viable long term. What we tried to do also was estimate the value of halls, the financial value of halls nationally, and the estimated rebuild costs we estimate to be around £1 billion, but that neglects lots of other valuable assets associated with halls, and we think the true value, the asset value of halls, could exceed £9 billion. So again, that reasserts just what important local and valuable asset halls can be. We asked lots of questions, and some of you will have gone through those tables in the survey which identify how your hall is being used. And what we can see is that private parties, preschool education are frequently the most frequent use for halls, and that these activities are actually growing. Use of halls for children's dance classes and fitness classes was also increasing, and that was a growing activity for about half of those halls that responded. A really interesting finding, I think, compared to the 2009 national survey, was that a greater proportion of halls saw that their hall was being used by a quarter to a half of their local population. So fewer halls think their hall is being used by less than a quarter, and more think that it's being used by a quarter to a half. So there's this perception that halls are being used, or were in 2020 being used more by local people. And nearly half of all halls in 2020 had sought advice from a local village hall advisor in the last 5 years, and that a greater proportion than in 2009 rated this service as excellent. Quite significantly greater proportion saw the service as excellent. So obviously we were asked to return to some of those respondents in March and April 2021 to really get a sense of how COVID-19 and the pandemic had impacted on them, returning to some of those questions around finances and use of halls and some of their kind of views of the future. Now we can have a lot of confidence, I think, in these results because the samples were quite similar. The characteristics of those who responded in 2020 and in 2021 are quite similar. So it helps assess, really give a picture of the impact of COVID-19. And one of the key things, and I'm going to say something about this at the end, is that halls have played a really important impact through this crisis. 15% of halls have played a formal role in the response to the pandemic, for instance, in providing emergency food provision or hosting NHS services. And as statutory designated places of safety, you know, we've really found out just how important villages are to some of our local communities, but they're not necessarily given the resources to match, and it poses the question about whether they're key infrastructure, but they're undervalued. And like I say, I'll come back to that issue. What we found was some worrying signs in 2021 that halls may not open again. About 1.4% of our sample suggested that that could be the case, which would be equivalent to about 140 halls nationally that would close, and was an indicator really of the immediate need for support. That's not to say that all halls have suffered dire kind of financial consequences through the pandemic. It was a bit polarised really. Some halls, they'd managed to save money and their finances were relatively healthy, whereas others had certainly seen their finances worsen. And it was generally speaking, the halls serving bigger communities that were hardest hit. And COVID-19 grants have been really key in addressing some of those concerns, and halls receiving them were less likely to see their financial position as worsening. But the long-term outlook, you could see in response that there was a lot of uncertainty, and the halls were worried about users returning and the financial implications of not being able to generate income. And hence there was a recommendation in our report for bridging or some form of responsive funding to help them in the short term. Flexible grant funding was seen as the most important form of support, alongside continued relief from business rates. And we made some recommendations in the report about how policymakers can really ensure that halls benefit from that mandatory full discretionary rate relief. So we spoke about the 2020 results and the planned improvements for halls, and a significant number of halls in 2021 had abandoned those planned improvements, as you can imagine. And interestingly, this is the chart on the right-hand side. A lot of those big capital investments were the things that were essentially not going ahead. So the replacement of an old hall, or the building of a new hall on a different site, extensions, energy efficiency measures and investments. And these were the things that that were not essentially going ahead. And again, we made the recommendation that the Village Hall Improvement Grant might really prevent that lack of investment happening, and it could be targeted at those halls where there were plans already in place in advance to undertake the work. What we could see in terms of the operation of halls and the services planned was that respondents were really thinking about diversifying their services, and were making capital investments through the lockdowns, for instance, and through the restricted periods that would help them diversify their services. But alongside that were worries that certain things may never return. Group activities would take a long time to return. There were some real worries about that. There were specific worries about older users not being able to return, and the impact of that on local communities in terms of people's well-being and loneliness, and concerns that volunteers would not be able to return to the kind of management and operational roles that halls that kind of help keep halls running. We asked respondents in a kind of open text box to say, what support do you need to recover from COVID-19? And the responses fell into three key themes, really. The first was to increase community involvement, and to support that, to enable halls to be run and governed properly as activities restart. The second was financial support to maintain and improve buildings and help halls grow their income. And the third was the provision of advice, support and training on the regulations around COVID-19, but also wider issues around health, public health and safety in those buildings, recruitment and fundraising. Linked to that, 54% of halls had received advice from the Village Hall community building services provided by an ACARE network member through the course of the previous year, and 98% had felt the support was good or excellent. So clearly, that support and advice has been vital to some halls in dealing with these changing restrictions and rules on usage. But halls really need the resources to access those services, so we make some recommendations about that in the report. So I'd like to finish really with a broader point about future, and this is the cover of a piece of research that was done by colleagues at Sheffield Hallam University. That was for the local trust, and they've done a series of research reports tracking how communities responded to COVID-19. I'd encourage you to look at those if you're interested. And they really reveal how communities adapt to this crisis, responded in informal and formal ways, developed new services, and became a key pillar of the response. And the opportunity now really for village halls and other community organisations is to say, now you see us, now you see our role in tackling these kind of crises. The next crisis may be a public health crisis, an environmental crisis, but we will be there as the key infrastructure within our communities to meet local needs. And it's really reminding policymakers and funders that needs investing in, and certainly needs investing in if we want to be ready for the next emergency or the next difficult point faced. So that's hopefully the research that we've done and colleagues have done provide the evidence to make some of that advocacy possible. Thank you ever so much for listening. I hope you have a good discussion afterwards. If anybody would like any more information, do get in contact. I'm sure my contact details can be provided, and these slides will be shared. So thanks for your time and have a good day.
Thank you, Tom. Yes, by all means, we will be sending out all the slides and information and the link to the surveys as well. They are really, really good. ACRE have been really good over the last, I think it's 30 years now, doing these surveys every 10 years. And they highlight some really useful statistics and trends over time and help inform policymakers, and brilliant if you need to get statistics for when you're putting your own funding bids in as well. It really does provide that evidence that you might need to persuade the funders that you're needing support. We're going to move swiftly on now so that we're keeping to timescale. I'd really like to welcome now to Chris Cowcher. Chris is from the Plunkett Foundation. Some of you will be familiar with the Plunkett Foundation. Some of you may have never heard of them. Chris is no stranger to RAD, as he's spoken at several of our events over the past 8 or 9 years. Chris, I think, used to work for ACRE, so he's fully knowledgeable about the role of ACRE and what village halls do. So it's going to be interesting to hear what Chris is going to talk about. So welcome, Chris. I'll pass over to you.
Thanks ever so much, Helena, and thank you ever so much for having me this morning. It is nice to see some familiar names in the Zoom as it is, rather than the room these days. And as Helena said, I used to work for ACRE, and prior to that, I used to work for Gloucestershire Rural Community Council. So very much so brilliant to be able to be a part of an ACRE network event such as today. And obviously following on from such a topical presentation and the kind of Now They See Us research, I'm going to give you a presentation related to community ownership, and we'll provide a brief introduction as to who Plunkett are, because as Helena said, not everybody is aware of who we are. So I'm just going to share my screen and hopefully this will all work. Okay, so hopefully everybody is now seeing my presentation. Just bear with me. There we go. So obviously, yeah, you've got my name and you know the date. So Plunkett Foundation is a 100-year-old charity. We support predominantly rural communities, so very much a link up with the ACRE network in that respect, but we operate across the UK, so we're outside of England also. We're relatively small in size. There's 17 members of staff and we're based in Oxfordshire. And the way that we achieve our UK-wide reach is through engaging with self-employed advisors or mentors or members of staff that are based within other organisations to provide that sort of on-the-ground one-to-one support and advice. So very, very briefly, the history of who we are. Plunkett's role and name is very much so intrinsically linked to the cooperative movement, and the gentleman you see on the screen there is Sir Horace Plunkett, who was the man that founded the foundation back in 1919. Sir Horace was the MP for Dublin and was very much so a key advocate and voice in growing the number of cooperatives in Ireland. And he saw a way that rural communities could be improved through cooperation. And he coined the phrase, better farming, better living, and better communities. Very quickly, Plunkett has 5 strategic objectives. You'll notice that we're coming to the end of our current strategy period. But one of them, which links to the reasons we're here today about a rural revival, is that it's about growing the number of community-owned businesses that exist across the UK. But more importantly, perhaps point 3 there, extending the social impact of these. And I'll touch on the reason why we're thinking of why businesses can be so much more than just a kind of core service provider in their local area. When I talk about a community business, and this is always a useful definition to offer, because when you're talking about cooperatives, people understand what a cooperative is. Plunkett about 6 years ago subscribed to a wider definition of community ownership and the sort of more increasingly accepted term community business. But we define those as ones that are locally rooted, ones that are genuinely based in a kind of geographic area and are engaging the local community to decide and drive forward the project. These projects remain accountable, so they bake into their kind of operating models democracy and think about an open and inclusive sort of membership and ownership structure. They have a trade, so they are a business. And again, this is something that many groups, when they're at the earliest point of thinking of a community ownership project, you might be surprised to hear actually often forget that, yes, there's a social campaign to set up a community-owned pub or save the post office. But the reality is there is a business that if you succeed in achieving the community ownership status, you will need to run thereafter. And then the fourth area is having that kind of broad and lasting community impact. Plunkett is most commonly known for our work in relation to community-owned pubs and community-owned shops. And what people might not appreciate is that essentially our work will offer advice and support to any group looking to use community ownership as a way of safeguarding, protecting, retaining, rejuvenating, and perhaps even reintroducing services or assets in a local area. So, we've worked with distilleries, we've worked with flour mills, we've worked with woodland groups, we've worked with farms. And essentially, I think this model where you are thinking about communities coming together, deciding what's important, creating a plan to think about using a community ownership structure and a business model thereafter is a way of enhancing the local area. And of course, from an acre network perspective, in many ways that might have come from the parish and community-led plan or a neighbourhood plan consultation that has identified a genuine need for something specific to exist within a local area. So the more than concept, we often talk about more than a pub, more than a shop. And the reason we do that is because we encourage groups when they are at the earliest point of setting up a community-owned business to really unpick and scratch beneath the surface of why a business might have closed previously. And the reason I flag that is because a number of community-owned businesses come about because they are responding to a closure. It's no surprise that the community shop network, for example, had its kind of bumper growth years off, when the post office network change program took place in 2008 and closed 2,500 post offices across the UK. Communities were fearful of obviously losing the shop at the same time, and a number of community shops were then set up. The idea of more than is that additionality, is thinking about how can we bring in new products, new services, and how can we do things differently, which may add to our financial sustainability, but also offer greater social impact. And actually, in the context of village halls, which I know is very much a theme throughout the conference, you are seeing more community businesses cohabiting and co-locating with village halls, either in an annex or within rooms already within the building. And I think the idea is that you are seeing shops thinking about, could we incorporate a cafe? Is there a facility that, that would benefit our local area to bring people together? Could we utilize and repurpose space within a community-owned asset to run health services? Or could we host the Citizens Advice Bureau? Could we host the credit union? You're looking at people that are thinking of implementing environmental initiatives to be conscious towards their net zero ambitions. And those questions are ones that I would encourage any project that is thinking about collective community ownership, again, where people are coming together to purchase an asset, are asking themselves at the beginning of the project. Relatively small in size, though they may be, small community-owned businesses actually are having significant economic impact, and it's growing. I'll touch on the numbers in a minute about the current size of the network across the UK, but these small businesses are connecting into the local supplier network. And I guess throughout the pandemic, perhaps we saw that exacerbated to the extent that, when we were told on the national news and in the national media about shortage of toilet paper and flour related to the great pandemic bake-off, actually you were seeing small rural retailers finding more creative ways of connecting up with their local supplier network, or actually partnering with other businesses that might be able to support them to do bulk buying activities. They create jobs, they create employment opportunities that could be more flexible because they are based upon the community conversations that exist in that local area. So, Plunkett talks about sort of full-time equivalents that are created within the kind of network of businesses that we're proud to support. But in reality, those full-time equivalent positions might be made up of multiple part-time positions, flexible hours that are more suited to a young parent or somebody fitting it around work, or someone only able to donate a certain number of hours a week to offer their kind of support. And again, there's an opportunity for collective investment via community shares. And I'm going to touch on this because of the fact that so many community businesses using this as a form of fundraising, but also building upon that kind of democratic structure that I talked about earlier on in terms of the operation. Now, community shares are essentially, in the community business world, a membership subscription to these organizations. And the model of business that Plunkett Foundation promotes is the Community Benefit Society, which is an old evolution of the cooperative model, but essentially includes a one member, one vote structure, meaning that those that are more affluent in the community can invest more, and those that are only able to invest relatively little will still have equal rights within the society and on the operations and have equal voting rights in the future. Obviously, those that are able to invest larger amounts may expect to see a return on their investment as these businesses grow, and that can be typically 2 to 3%, which is pretty comparable with what you see in a number of other investments opportunities at this moment in time. The social impact is, of course, central to all of these businesses. This picture here, actually, I took the last time I spoke in person at a Rural Action Derbyshire event at the Anglers Rest in Bamford, which is a community-owned pub with a community-owned cafe and a community-owned post office all on site. These operations are inclusive. They look to reduce local isolation, and they bring together different generations, be that through the staff and the volunteers involved, or through the services that they offer under one roof. And I think that is an evolving model, because these businesses might set out to serve one thing, but because you are constantly consulting, constantly engaging, and that these businesses are owned by the community, run by the community, for the community, they are constantly adapting and growing their services. But the social impact is just something that is intrinsically baked into the operation from the word go. And of course, very topical right now off the back of the COP26 conference, we are seeing more and more community businesses making demonstrable effort towards considerations relating to their environmental impact. I mean, many of them were already contributing significantly around the reduction of travel. By having a service within your village or within your market town reduces the need to travel elsewhere to access that. But we are seeing others starting to think about, how could we increase our environmental credentials with any kind of new build operations? If they are working with a village hall and putting an extension on, could that be a sustainable extension, in terms of the building project? And of course, I've talked about management of green spaces and woodlands as a community-owned business model. And what you have there is you've got training looking at heritage skills and environmental management. That means that we are looking after green spaces that have been so important over the last 18 months when we've had to do our daily walks and exercise, access to the countryside and any kind of space where we can get leisurely activities going on has been really important. And community ownership can help people to understand the environment in which they're in and actually how they can be contributing to the longer term activities in those areas. So Plunkett Foundation currently supports, so I do put this as this is Plunkett Foundation support, so that there are more community-owned businesses than this that exists. But in our network, we talk about 800 community-owned businesses, with 700 of those being in rural areas. The predominant model that Plunkett works with is shops and pubs at this moment in time, but the other forms of business are growing in number. And we don't compartmentalize them as much as shops and pubs because their sector size is so small. So land-based businesses could be food co-ops, community farms, woodland groups, and any other form of environmental linked activity. The other types of businesses refer to your breweries, your distilleries, your flour mills. And again, hopefully as they start to grow, you'll start to break down their number in a similar way as we have to community shops and pubs. The 3,000 full-time employment, full-time equivalent staff is impressive for the number of businesses there are. But I think, following on from the previous presentation, it's the volunteer network that drives these businesses. Even those that have paid staff out front serving customers will still have a volunteer network behind the scenes that's running the kind of legal activities, the governance of the organization, completing the financial returns for the organization, completing the community consultations. And I think that network of individuals is one that we would like to cherish, celebrate, but also appreciate that there's further support needed to make sure that there is succession planning within the sector going forward. The final point on this slide is one that shows the remarkable resilience of these community-owned businesses. Relatively few close their doors having come into community ownership, and the 92.5 success rate compares to 44% for small and medium enterprises from the ONS statistics that show that the community ownership model is one, because it is intrinsically linked to its customer base and to the geography of where it exists, there is that ability to adapt and make sure that you are continuing to react to certain situations. Recent research that we've just completed a number of community businesses cited their community ownership status as the reason that they were able to navigate the pandemic. And if you put that in the context of the 145 pubs that are shown on this page, the reality is the hospitality trade has been decimated and has been faced by numerous challenges and lockdowns over the last 18 months that has made it very difficult to navigate and any kind of long-term planning. But the community-owned pub sector is in a buoyant state. It actually grew during the pandemic, which is phenomenal effort on the part of those volunteers. And they actually are stating now that they see a long-term confidence rating, which is far higher than it was just 12 months ago, when at which point the surveys were being completed around about April 2020. And of course, at that point, people knew very little about how long restrictions were going to last. And the idea of a vaccine was a long way off at that moment in time, or seemingly so. In the context of Derbyshire, we currently engage directly with 8 community-owned businesses within your county, and all of them are fantastic examples of how community shops could run. And interestingly, Drone Valley Brewery is one. If you've not tried their beers, I would certainly recommend. It's a very tasty product, but again, interesting to see the community ownership model thinking differently about different forms of business. So the impact of the pandemic, the interest in community ownership has never been higher. We saw a 53% increase in inquiries to our lines in 2020, but I think continuing from that point, with the number of pressures that are placed on other businesses, people are seeing community ownership as a way of protecting assets that might be at risk of closure. People's shopping habits have changed, although we have all, mobilized some form of online shopping over the last 18 months. People have valued local services and products where they are able to access them. And I think there is that ability for us to build upon that moment and think that community ownership could continue responding. It's not all positive in terms of thinking about the shopping and that localization, because actually the issues on the supply chain have meant at times that there are products that people haven't been able to access as readily as they should have been able to. And actually that has been further exacerbated this year by the driver shortages and pickers in warehouses shortages, meaning that some of the wholesalers are not able to service the shops that we work with as best they could. And we're actually working with our membership at the moment to make representation to a number of the national wholesalers on that regard. And the share capital vulnerability is brought about because people's situations have changed during the pandemic. People have sadly lost lives. People have decided that they no longer want to live in the area in which they live. And so people are thinking about their investment in the community business as one that they may wish to change in the coming future. So community businesses are having to pivot and respond and react in this moment to think about how can we service the kind of request for withdrawal of shares, or thinking slightly differently about the makeup of our membership now that there might be new people coming into the community. And the volunteer numbers have fluctuated. We saw, like many other community projects in 2020, a bit of a boom from people that were furloughed or students coming home from university that were willing to get involved in their community businesses and in their community projects. But it was on a time limited offer that as soon as they've returned to work, those numbers have returned to normal. And then again, the normality has been decimated further by the fact that there are individuals that were advised to shield throughout 2020 that would have normally been on the front line. And actually some of those have not yet returned because of the fact that this is an enduring pandemic, and that ongoing concern has led them to think differently about their role in the community business. But looking forward, there is money available right now to support community-owned projects. The UK government launched the Community Ownership Fund in the spring this year, and there will be further details about a second round of a 4-year programme coming out imminently. The SPF, sorry, I shouldn't have used a kind of short-term acronym, is the Shared Prosperity Fund. This is the replacement for European monies of past, and may well be an opportunity to invest in community-owned projects and kind of innovative ways of service delivery in rural areas. And again, as further details of that start to come out, there is opportunities related to community business. There are more loan finance options around, because I think groups are thinking about the kind of blended financial approach to setting up their community-owned business. And the reason that we think actually loan products are quite good for community-owned businesses, going back to that point, some groups don't think about the word business at the point of thinking of a community project. If you are thinking you have to service a loan from day one, it gets you into the mindset of what kind of things you've got to cover from a financial incomings and going. Shared ownership of assets, and this is something that is already commonly in place in rural areas where you've got village halls that might have a tenant community business, or you might have multiple community organizations having a part ownership of a site and a space. And I think that is only going to grow in number, because as people think about the kind of multi-use, the multi-purpose, the multi-functioning of community assets, we are going to see more things happening under one roof. The employment and skills I've obviously touched on, and a more connected infrastructure is one that I think that awareness of community ownership and rural community and small rural community businesses is only likely to get better if we can continue championing through conferences like today, through the work of the ACRE network and other rural bodies that are championing the case for rural communities at this time. So I just wanted to show a few pictures because, you know, sometimes it's hard to convey what do we mean by community business, and everybody thinks of kind of, you know, a shop has to be in Mrs. Goggins's post office on Friday Street, which might traditionally have been where they had come from, but actually they come in all shapes and sizes. So this is Kirkmichael Village Shop, which is on a petrol forecourt, and actually thinks about this was in their community. The retention of the petrol station was one of the most important things for them. The nearest fueling station was quite a considerable distance away. And so community ownership has been a way of protecting for this local area, the petrol station, and also, as you can see from the sign, a kind of multi-functioning shop thereafter and post office. The community-owned woodlands encourages people to think beyond just this being a kind of about protecting the green space, and actually think about how do we use the green space for community benefit. And the business element comes from things like training, or it could be health and well-being activities, or it could be working and running community events where people are paying and buying into using the green space more responsibly. And as I said before, you know, many of the community woodlands are, you know, key components in protecting sort of heritage skills that might have been lost years ago, coppicing and sort of, you know, thinking about, you know, responsible woodland management. And again, this model is seemingly linked to that movement. This here is a disused toilet down in Cornwall. And yes, it very much still has the ladies and gents signs, but has been gutted and now has a shop on the inside. And again, this is the idea of repurposing public assets. And so you may well find, you know, and I know from my times of driving through the Peak District, there are spaces where there are redundant toilet blocks, or there are redundant police stations or council outposts. You know, those buildings could be repurposed for community benefit. And the idea is that community businesses having that community consultation, genuinely thinking about what they want to offer in the local area, can be, you know, serviced through sort of multiple ways of activity. And, you know, obviously the toilet block is quite a good focus on that mind. It could be a new build. This here is the Borough down in Devon, one of the most environmentally friendly community-owned shops. It's built into a hillside, and what you're seeing here is a really innovative piece of architecture in the centre of a village, but showing how, and this was using European money actually previously, so going back to the Shared Prosperity Fund, this is the kind of project we would still hope to see supported by that fund in future. And this has got multiple services under one roof, but has created a real kind of example of excellence for others to think, you know, could we create something like that in our community? It doesn't affect the landscape because they've built it into the hillside, so they're not having that kind of impact of a new build in the middle of a rural area that changes the appearance of the community. And the final point here, and this is very relative because you've got Grindleford obviously in existence in Derbyshire, is that community businesses working with places of worship and churches in rural communities is an obvious opportunity that could be further exploited, you know, more universally across the country. There are a growing number of examples of community businesses co-locating with a church. And I think this is something that Plunkett is really keen to see. You know, if I said at the moment, 1 in 9 projects that come to Plunkett go on to trading status, that shows that 8 have somewhere along the line failed in their process or have diverted to think differently about how they can service their community needs. The number one reason for that is often the lack of available premises from which to run the community business. So obviously the village hall and the community building is a great space to use, but if that is already in full use and has no opportunity for further development, you know, please can I encourage you to think about how could you work with the church at a time when you might be seeing diminishing faith communities and less usage of the church than previously. And we've been working with an organisation called the All Churches Trust to actually offer development grants to groups that are thinking about this way of working. And I think that opportunity to be creative and use these spaces for community benefit, again, is an opportunity, in this moment. So very quickly, I'm coming to the end of my presentation now, but the offer here on the table is that Plunkett offers an end-to-end comprehensive offer of advice and support to all forms of community business at any stage of their development. And when you have reached that trading status, we certainly will remain available and contactable. We have a membership scheme, we offer discounts to suppliers, and our kind of ongoing development and training advice is something we would encourage all community businesses to continue to be a part of. The peer networking, though, is probably where best community businesses should be looking to as soon as they start on a journey, because you need to learn from others, those that have been there and done it before. We will convey the advice and expertise that we are able to offer, but actually hearing it from other volunteers and other businesses that have trodden the path before you, can be transformative on your project. And when you're open and trading, gives you a really good sounding board to share ideas with. So finally, and this is why, community ownership, thinking about a kind of rural revival, we see 5 opportunities coming out of the pandemic. And I think it just picks up on the points that I've spoken about throughout this presentation. Community-owned businesses, offer an opportunity to lead the way in relocalization of supply chains. How can we create a more fair and equitable access to, affordable food in rural areas? And could there be greater links with local food producers, local farms, and thinking about how could we use a more purposeful outlet of rural community businesses to be the selling and the vending points for that. We have to do more to boost employment and training. I mean, one of the biggest barriers that Plunkett as an organisation and many of our rural partners encounter is that often the rural idyll and the beautiful countryside masks the hidden deprivations that exist in rural areas. And often the kind of in-work poverty is certainly a conversation that we hear often. So creating fair paid, lasting employment opportunities may well create a more inclusive opportunity for younger people to remain in the countryside, or different people to think differently about their role in terms of offering and running services. Digital technologies, where connectivity permits, I'll always say, is definitely something that I think groups have done more so during the pandemic. You saw little village shops competing with the likes of the big supermarkets and retailers doing online ordering forms and click and collect and home delivery systems. I mean, yes, granted, some of those systems were pretty much a WhatsApp group with the shop manager convening, who was there, or the Good Neighbour scheme running it. But the reality is, it made it more convenient to shop with the local village shop without having to go down there. And I think people are appreciating differently that the convenience of ordering from a online major retailer where you need to book a delivery slot 5 days down the road is actually competitive with what you can access on your doorstep. The volunteer network has to be our priority focus. We have to diversify the volunteer network and think about, creativity to, future-proof and bring in new generations to think differently about the role of volunteering within their local area, and how can we as an organization and as a rural network of bodies, support different individuals to think about their role and responsibilities in their community, and how can they contribute more. And that might be more flexible volunteer opportunities. So often we hear a conversation about community shops that perhaps shut their doors at 5 o'clock. I mean, myself, I don't get home till 7. By the time I've put my young boy to bed, it would be about 8 o'clock before I could offer any kind of volunteering time. But I would be willing to do that. If there was a community business in my area. Those conversations, again, though, relate to going back to community consultation constantly. And again, I'll finish on by saying it's about the positive environmental impact, which we have to retain and focus. There is a climate crisis happening right now, and those small actions that these kind of businesses can be making in their areas can be having huge and meaningful impact when you start to aggregate them all together. And so finally, those are contact details. I know that Sky has taken this presentation from us, so I believe can be made available to you all. But keep in touch. Plunkett Foundation is absolutely committed to supporting all forms of community-owned businesses, and we're keen to collaborate with as many partners as possible. So Rural Action Derbyshire offering us a chance to come and speak to you all today has been fantastic, and I really look forward to hopefully seeing more projects in the Derbyshire area in future. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen because I can see there's a few questions, and there's nothing worse than when there's I'm up and there's no grid. So Helena, I'll hand back to you to manage this part, if I may.
Thank you, Chris. That's been really inspirational. I'm sure it's giving people lots of thoughts and ideas of what they could possibly do. Thinking about village halls, though, I just want to pick up on one of the things that you did say, because obviously village halls are specific to their objects of their charity. That if they are thinking of, and I know several halls that have mentioned it to me recently, that community cafes especially, they want to set up. But what charities need to be really clear on is that any space within their the footprint of their hall has to be surplus to their normal charitable uses. So do be careful, and obviously we can offer advice on that before they get to that stage of deciding whether they can. It has to be space within their village hall that's not used for its charitable purposes, and if there is space within the hall, then yes, it is definitely worth exploring, looking at how community shops, cafes can be set up, ideal places in village halls located in the centre of the village. So there's just a couple of things here, Chris. From Lucy, do you have more details about the setup of a community benefit society? She's a CVS Group Development Officer. She'd be interested to hear more about how this kind of social enterprise is set up. So,
absolutely. I mean, so I can certainly share more details. I mean, Plunkett Foundation promotes the Community Benefit Society and actually offers a model rules service where we actually have a pre-registered set of model rules that are registered with the Financial Conduct Authority. But essentially it is based on the cooperative model. So it is about member ownership. So multiple people will purchase a share or a membership in that organization, which creates the share capital. It's governed by the Financial Conduct Authority. And within it, you're looking at kind of asset locks to protect the ongoing operation of the business. But I can certainly, Lucy, provide a document which our colleagues at Cooperatives UK pulled together many years ago called Simply Legal, which talks together across all different forms of community business. Because I should stress the point that whilst we promote the Community Benefit Society because of its democratic structure, there are multiple models of community and social enterprise that other organizations may wish to look at. Obviously, from an acre network point, that might be a charitable incorporated organization, thinking about kind of updating and modernizing charities that are running village halls at this moment. It could be a community interest company, or it could even be a company limited by shares or guarantee. And the reason I put that final point in, and people might think that's not a community or social enterprise, is because often these businesses are having to operate at speed. If you are using the asset of community value and the Localism Act, to create a moratorium period offering you the first right to buy or bid on a premises, that gives you 6 months. And sometimes thinking about the legal structures is something that really is a concern for groups. And so acting at speed might make you choose to do a company limited by guarantee or a CIC because they can be set up in days. For reference, a community benefit society might take up to 2 weeks. But that doesn't actually say at a later point you might then convert over to another form of business, and it's relatively easy to change a company limited by guarantee into a CBS at a later point if you want to bake in that democratic model and that structure at the heart of the operation.
That's fine. I mean, we just had a comment here from Live and Local from Michelle. It's not so much about community benefit societies. It's saying, talking about supporting being environmentally friendly. Live and Local provide local dance and music classes and things and shows. So people do look at that in chat because Michelle has left a link there for you. Another thing for village halls to pick up on about the space, if they've got that surplus space, if they have that surplus space, they then have to think, should it be a lease? Should it be a license, an occupational license for the organisation to use that space? in your experience then, Chris, with working with village halls, I would imagine it's more the occupational license that is the better way to go, because it's difficult for charities to sublease a part of their hall, and it's not giving them secure, permanent security of tenure with a lease. So if you have the occupational license, it's just done on a yearly basis, and it does give the village hall charity a little bit of control over the letting of that part of their building. Have you come across that as an issue working?
It is a conversation, and actually our first point of call is always to go to the Oracle on Village Halls, Deborah Clark at Acre, and have those conversations about what is most appropriate. And actually, where it's a local group in a geographic county where we know there's an Acre network member, we'd encourage them to speak to the Village Halls Advisory Service anyway, because I think it's really important that if there is to be a cohabiting or co-location of a community business alongside a village hall, it needs to be on the basis of the fact that these are two community institutions that are operating for local benefit, and therefore the operation needs to reflect that there is a long-term nature to the relationship, and it has to be set up in the most appropriate way from the word go.
Yeah, and also charities would have to inform the Charity Commission of whatever they're planning to do in advance, so that they do get some sort of consent, agreement or go ahead from the Charity Commission before they undertake sort of commercial side of things. There's nothing else in chat. I don't know if anybody else has any last questions. Just to add that, yeah, we can provide a model occupational license for this purpose. So anybody that is considering going down the route of finding out whether it's a viable option for them, then do get in contact with us. Chris, that's been absolutely inspirational. And it's good to hear that there's those examples within Derbyshire. It'd be great to add one to the list that's a village hall within Derbyshire. So let's watch this space and see what happens. But I think it's around coffee break time, unless there's any last questions while Chris is here. Are you staying for the whole morning, Chris? Or? I'm
afraid I'm not. I'm into another meeting in 15 minutes time at 11 o'clock. So I wish you all very well. I mean, I think what's been pulled together by Rural Action Derbyshire, you've got some really inspirational presentations and conversations. So I hope you all take as much away from the days as possible, and absolutely the commitment is we're here to work with you, and very keen to see how these positive conversations about a rural revival could involve community ownership along the way in that process.
Absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much, Chris.
Thanks all. Okay. Take care.
Right, so we will now break for a coffee break, and we're going to resume at 11 o'clock, and we have the